Why ignorant people always sound so confident. There is something deeply exhausting about living in a world where the loudest people are often the ones who understand the least. You notice it everywhere. The person who has never seriously studied a subject speaks with absolute certainty. The person who barely reads argues like they possess hidden wisdom. The person who understands almost nothing about history, psychology, science, or human nature somehow feels qualified to explain everything. Meanwhile, the people who genuinely think deeply hesitate. They pause. They question themselves. They consider complexity. And because of that hesitation, society often mistakes intelligence for weakness. George Carlin understood this better than most people. He looked at the modern world and realized something painfully obvious. Ignorance is not rare. Ignorance is rewarded. And perhaps the most dangerous thing about ignorance is not stupidity itself. It is confidence. Because a person who knows very little but believes they know everything becomes almost impossible to reason with. And if you have ever felt frustrated watching confident fools dominate conversations while thoughtful people remain silent, then this video is for you. Because today we are going to talk about one of the most uncomfortable truths about human society. Why ignorant people often appear more powerful than intelligent people. Why shallow thinking spreads faster than wisdom. Why society rewards certainty more than truth. And why the modern world seems designed to make intelligent people feel invisible. Before we begin, take 1 second and like this video. Not because it helps an algorithm, but because conversations like this are becoming increasingly rare. And if you enjoy deep psychological observations, social commentary, and brutally honest truths about human nature, subscribe to the channel. Because what we are about to discuss is not entertainment. It is recognition. George Carlin once said, "Think of how stupid the average person is, and realize half of them are stupider than that." People laughed. But beneath the humor was something deeply disturbing. Because Carlin was not merely insulting humanity. He was pointing toward a psychological reality that shapes modern civilization. Most people do not think deeply. They react. They repeat. They absorb opinions from media, culture, family, politics, and social pressure. Then they mistake those borrowed opinions for intelligence. And the truly dangerous part is this. The less people understand, the more certain they often become. Psychologists call this the Dunning-Kruger Effect. A cognitive bias where people with low competence overestimate their own intelligence because they lack the very knowledge necessary to recognize their incompetence. In simple terms, ignorant people are too ignorant to realize they are ignorant. And once you understand this, the modern world suddenly starts making a lot more sense. You begin noticing why the least informed people often speak with the strongest conviction. Why complex issues get reduced into simplistic slogans. Why emotional certainty spreads faster than thoughtful analysis. Because intelligence naturally creates caution. The more you learn, the more aware you become of how much you still do not know. A truly intelligent person understands complexity. They understand nuance. They understand uncertainty. That awareness creates humility. But humility does not dominate social media. Humility does not go viral. Humility does not win shouting matches. Confidence does. Even when that confidence is built entirely on ignorance. And that is one of the great tragedies of modern society. The people most willing to speak are often the least qualified to lead. Carlin understood that society does not reward intelligence nearly as much as people like to pretend. It rewards simplicity, certainty, entertainment, emotional stimulation. Think about modern media. Most headlines are not designed to educate. They are designed to provoke emotion, fear, anger, outrage, validation. Because emotional reactions generate attention, and attention generates profit. The media discovered long ago that people prefer comforting illusions over uncomfortable truths. A complicated answer rarely becomes popular, but a simplistic answer repeated with confidence spreads everywhere. That is why shallow thinkers thrive in public discourse. They make reality feel emotionally manageable. Intelligent people often do the opposite. They complicate things. They introduce uncertainty. They ask difficult questions. And most people do not enjoy uncertainty. Human beings crave psychological comfort. We want clear villains, clear heroes, clear answers. But reality is rarely that simple. And the people who understand this are often punished socially for acknowledging it. George Carlin once joked that people are wonderful individually, But once they become groups, they become dangerous. Because groups simplify thought. Groups reward conformity. Groups punish independent thinking. And the moment people become emotionally attached to an idea, logic becomes almost irrelevant. You can show evidence. You can present facts. You can explain carefully. But if truth threatens a person's identity, most people will reject truth before they reject identity. That is why arguing with deeply ignorant people often feels impossible. You are not debating information. You are challenging emotional survival mechanisms. And the ego will protect itself at almost any cost. This is why ignorance becomes so aggressive. Because beneath arrogance usually exists fear. The fear of being wrong. The fear of appearing unintelligent. The fear of uncertainty. And instead of confronting those fears honestly, people compensate with louder certainty. The modern world amplifies this problem constantly. Social media rewards emotional confidence more than intellectual depth. The algorithm does not care who is correct. It cares who keeps attention. And outrage captures attention better than wisdom. Simplistic opinions spread faster than thoughtful analysis because they are easier to consume. Thinking deeply requires effort. Reacting emotionally does not. And so society slowly becomes addicted to intellectual fast food. Quick opinions. Quick outrage. Quick certainty. Nobody pauses long enough to think carefully anymore. Carlin saw this long before social media fully existed. He understood that modern culture was not creating independent thinkers. It was creating consumers. Consumers of entertainment. Consumers of ideology. Consumers of emotional stimulation. And once people become addicted to constant stimulation, deep thought starts feeling uncomfortable. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Complexity becomes uncomfortable. Reflection becomes uncomfortable. People begin confusing information with wisdom. But information alone does not create intelligence. True intelligence requires self-awareness. And self-awareness is painful. Because the moment you become truly self-aware, you realize how much of your thinking was shaped by external forces. Your beliefs, your fears, your opinions, your reactions. Much of it was inherited unconsciously. Most people never want to face this. It is easier to believe you are already right. It is easier to attack others than question yourself. That is why ignorance often feels emotionally satisfying. It protects the ego from discomfort. Intelligence does the opposite. Intelligence destabilizes certainty. The more thoughtful a person becomes, the more they recognize contradiction inside themselves. And that creates humility. Einstein once said, "The more I learn, the more I realize how much I do not know." That sentence contains the entire difference between wisdom and ignorance. Ignorance believes it has reached the destination. Wisdom understands there is no final destination, only deeper understanding. And because intelligent people understand complexity, they often hesitate. They reconsider. They revise. They remain open to being wrong. Unfortunately, society often mistakes this openness for weakness. Meanwhile, ignorant people project certainty. And certainty is persuasive, especially to frightened populations. History repeatedly proves this. Many of the world's most dangerous leaders were not intellectual giants. They were emotionally persuasive simplifiers. They offered easy answers during difficult times. And frightened people embraced certainty over truth. Because certainty feels psychologically safe. That is why propaganda works. Not because people are inherently evil, but because fear reduces critical thinking. And fearful populations become vulnerable to confident manipulation. Carlin often mocked political systems because he recognized this cycle clearly. He understood that modern society frequently rewards charisma over competence, performance over wisdom, noise over substance. And the frightening part is how easily populations adapt to it. People stop demanding truth. They start demanding emotional comfort. And once comfort becomes more important than truth, society enters dangerous territory. Because lies that feel good become more powerful than truths that feel uncomfortable. Now here is something important. This conversation is not about believing intelligent people are superior human beings. That is not the point. The point is understanding how society treats thought itself. A society that discourages critical thinking eventually becomes emotionally fragile. People lose the ability to tolerate disagreement. They lose the ability to analyze complexity. Everything becomes tribal. Everything becomes emotional. Everything becomes us versus them. And in environments like that, thoughtful individuals often withdraw, not because they lack courage, because constant intellectual dishonesty becomes exhausting. Imagine spending years carefully studying reality only to watch shallow certainty dominate every conversation. Eventually, many intelligent people stop speaking, not because they have nothing valuable to say, but because they understand most people are not actually searching for truth. They are searching for validation. And there is a massive difference between those two things. A person searching for truth can change their mind. A person searching for validation only wants emotional reinforcement. Carlin understood this perfectly. That is why his comedy felt simultaneously hilarious and depressing. Because beneath every joke existed grief. Grief for a society becoming increasingly shallow. Grief for people surrendering independent thought. Grief for a culture that confuses consumption with meaning. He saw people drowning in distraction. Television, advertising, politics, celebrity worship, endless entertainment, all functioning like psychological anesthesia, keeping people stimulated enough not to think deeply about their lives. And today that problem has intensified dramatically. Most people can no longer sit quietly with their own thoughts. The moment silence appears, they reach for stimulation. A phone, a screen, noise, anything to avoid reflection. But reflection is where intelligence grows. Not in constant stimulation. Not in endless distraction. Wisdom requires stillness. It requires discomfort. It requires confronting uncertainty honestly. And that process feels psychologically threatening to many people. Which is why ignorance often appears emotionally stronger. Because ignorance avoids internal conflict. An ignorant person rarely questions themselves deeply. They rarely experience existential uncertainty. They rarely wrestle with complexity. Life appears simpler inside shallow thinking. But simple thinking creates dangerous consequences. Because reality itself is complicated. And when simplistic minds attempt solving complicated problems, disaster often follows. Look throughout history. Many atrocities were committed by people convinced they were absolutely right. Certainty without wisdom becomes terrifying, especially when combined with power. That is why Carlin distrusted authority so deeply. Not because every authority figure is evil, but because systems naturally attract confident personalities. And confidence is not the same thing as intelligence. Some of the most dangerous people in history genuinely believed they were saving the world. That is what makes human psychology so frightening. People can commit enormous harm while feeling morally justified, because the ego is extraordinarily skilled at protecting its own self-image. Most people do not view themselves as villains. Even when behaving destructively, they rationalize, they justify, they simplify. And once ideology enters the picture, critical thinking often disappears entirely. This is why independent thought matters so much. Not blind skepticism, not paranoia, not contrarian behavior for the sake of ego. Real independent thinking. The willingness to question emotionally comfortable narratives. The willingness to say, maybe I do not fully understand this. The willingness to tolerate uncertainty. Ironically, that willingness is often what separates intelligent people from ignorant people. Ignorance rushes towards certainty. Wisdom moves carefully. And yet society often rewards the opposite. People admire certainty because certainty appears powerful. But genuine intelligence is rarely loud. It is observant, patient, self-questioning, calm. Carlin understood this deeply. He knew that modern culture mistakes performance for substance constantly. The loudest person in the room is rarely the wisest. Often they are simply the least aware of their own limitations. And perhaps that is one of the saddest realities intelligent people eventually discover. Truth alone does not guarantee influence. Reality does not automatically defeat illusion. Sometimes illusions spread faster because they feel emotionally easier. And once people become emotionally attached to illusions, removing them feels like psychological violence. That is why intelligent people often feel isolated. Not because they hate humanity, but because they see contradictions others prefer ignoring. They notice manipulation. They notice propaganda. They notice emotional irrationality. And after a while, it becomes difficult to participate in society naively. Carlin reached a point where he stopped trying to save the world. He simply observed it. Not because he lacked compassion, because he understood human nature. People rarely change through logic alone. Most change only after suffering forces reflection. And sometimes, even suffering changes nothing. That realization can become emotionally exhausting, especially for thoughtful individuals. You begin realizing how little control you truly have over collective ignorance. And eventually you face a choice. Become bitter or develop humor. Carlin chose humor because humor creates emotional distance. It allows you to observe absurdity without being destroyed by it. That may be one of the deepest forms of wisdom. The ability to recognize the madness of the world without becoming consumed by rage. Because constant anger eventually destroys the person carrying it. And intelligent people are especially vulnerable to this. The more aware you become of societal dysfunction, the easier it becomes to fall into despair. You start noticing manipulation everywhere, dishonesty everywhere, superficiality everywhere. And if you are not careful, awareness itself becomes emotionally toxic. That is why balance matters. Yes, the world contains enormous ignorance. Yes, many systems reward shallow thinking. Yes, confident fools often dominate public discourse. But becoming emotionally consumed by that reality helps nobody. At some point, wisdom requires acceptance, not passive surrender. Acceptance, the recognition that ignorance has always existed, and probably always will. Human beings are imperfect creatures, emotional, fearful, easily manipulated, capable of brilliance and stupidity simultaneously. Carlin understood that contradiction beautifully. That is why his work still resonates. Because beneath the cynicism existed honesty. And honest observations feel strangely liberating, especially in a culture built on illusion. The truth is, you cannot force people to think deeply. You cannot argue someone out of ignorance if their identity depends on remaining ignorant. And trying to save everyone will emotionally destroy you. The wiser path is learning where to place your energy. Seek thoughtful people. Seek honest conversations. Seek environments where complexity is welcomed rather than punished. And most importantly, continue thinking independently. Because independent thought is becoming increasingly rare. The modern world constantly pressures people toward tribal certainty. Pick a side. Repeat the script. Attack the opposition. Never pause long enough to think critically. But real intelligence often exists outside rigid ideological identities. It exists in observation, curiosity, nuance, humility, and perhaps that is the final lesson hidden inside Carlin's worldview. Do not become arrogant simply because you recognize ignorance in others, because arrogance itself creates blindness. The moment you believe you are completely immune to foolishness, you become vulnerable to it. Every human being contains blind spots. Every human mind distorts reality in some way. Wisdom begins the moment you recognize that truth inside yourself. And maybe that is why truly intelligent people remain cautious. They understand their own capacity for self-deception. Ignorance says, I already know everything. Wisdom says, I must remain aware of how easily the mind can fool itself. That humility protects intelligent people from becoming ideological extremists. It keeps them psychologically flexible. And flexibility matters enormously in a changing world. Because rigid certainty eventually breaks. Reality always exposes oversimplification eventually. Always. The problem is that sometimes societies suffer tremendously before that correction happens. History proves this repeatedly. Civilizations ignore wisdom, reward emotional manipulation, glorify shallow thinking, then act shocked when consequences arrive. Carlin saw this cycle clearly. And instead of pretending humanity was evolving into perfect rationality, he laughed. Not because nothing matters, but because humor was his way of surviving awareness. And maybe we need some of that perspective ourselves. Not blind cynicism, not hopelessness, but perspective. The ability to observe human absurdity without losing your sanity. The ability to think deeply without becoming emotionally consumed by darkness. The ability to recognize ignorance while remaining compassionate toward human imperfection. Because despite everything, people are still human. Fearful, confused, searching for meaning, trying to survive psychologically in a world that often feels overwhelming. Some respond to that uncertainty with curiosity. Others respond with rigid certainty. And perhaps that difference explains almost everything about modern society. If this conversation resonated with you, take a moment and like this video. Not for validation, but because thoughtful conversations deserve visibility in a world drowning in noise. And comment below with one observation you have noticed about modern society. What do you think is making people less capable of deep thinking today? I genuinely want to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy psychological analysis, George Carlin philosophy, social criticism, and deeper conversations about human nature, subscribe to the channel. Because we are going much deeper from here. The world may never fully escape ignorance. But that does not mean you have to become part of it. Stay aware. Stay thoughtful. Stay capable of questioning yourself. Because in a world addicted to certainty, the ability to think deeply may become one of the rarest forms of intelligence left.